Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. On today's episode, I'm speaking with one of my favorite chroniclers of the populist moment in American politics, Bloomberg's Joshua Green. Joshua has a new book out. It's called The Rebels. It's all about the populist left, everyone from Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders to, of course, AOC. He also wrote a book back in 2017, 2018 called The Devil's Bargain. It's all about Steve Bannon and the populist right. I think reading these two books together is a really fascinating way of considering the past, present, and future of American politics. The Rebels is really focused on how the 2008 financial crisis and the Obama administration's efforts to both address the issues, but also not quite address the issues, to put it lightly, are really at the center of the book's core. And understanding how the Biden administration has worked to take those critiques of 2010's Democratic policy and actually try to build a new coalition moving into 2024 is really key. So hope you all enjoy this conversation, but also, like I said in the episode, read these two books together because understanding how the populist left, populist right have come to attack the political establishment, while also then cataloging how the political establishment has sought to kind of take those critiques and put them into their actual programs shows how American politics really works. Hope you all enjoy the conversation. Joshua Green, welcome to the Realignment.
Great to be with you.
So something I like to do, especially with an author whose work I really enjoy, is I like to kind of find a theme that ties together their underlying work, especially with two different books. So 2018, you did Devil's Bargain. It's about Steve Bannon and his role in Donald Trump's rise. And the new book out now is called The Rebels. It's about AOC, Bernie, and Elizabeth Warren. And it seems to me the tie between these two books and this like theme of your work is that if we're looking at the American political system, at any one moment, there are just figures, trends, and dynamics that are going to be incredibly important a few years out, but everyone is just totally unaware of. So like in 2011, you meet Steve Bannon when he's hawking a mediocre Sarah Palin documentary that no one had ever seen.
Yes, I did.
And then two, in this book, if it's 2011, 2012, 2013, okay, the financial crisis, it's in the past, we're moving forward, 2012 election, Obama wins, but actually the whole time, that underlying dissatisfaction with the response is going to play a huge role in the latter half of the 2010s. So here's my first question for you. Sitting in the year 2023, could you think of any figures, ideas, themes, or just dynamics that you're kind of thinking about that maybe could end up being a much bigger deal in like 2028 or 2032 that we're not thinking about?
Yeah, I can. I'm going to give you a weird two-part answer to that. So one, I love your framing of the issue. Is there a theme that kind of unites your work? And there absolutely is for me as a writer and in these two books in particular. And I think of it in terms of populism. That The Devil's Bargain was a book about Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the rise of right-wing populism. And I sort of, traced that up through the 2016 election because I weirdly known those guys and spent a lot of time with them. And the new book, The Rebels, is really the flip side of that coin. It's about the rise of left-wing populism since the financial crisis, told through the stories of like three people that I think, and thought back then, are really important historical figures, even though none of them is in the White House today. And that's Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and AOC. Now, as we're sitting here today, everybody at the high levels of American politics is like 100 years old, right? We've got, Warren and Bernie and Trump and Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and everybody. So to answer your question about 2023, I mean, the person that I'm most interested to keep an eye on is my third character, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, partly because she's the kind of generational representative of this brand of left populism that I write about. And also kind of like from an actuarial standpoint, she may be the only one left on the scene 10 years from now. Certainly the only one I think that will be holding elected office. And what's interesting to me, first about the 2024 election, which I really do think is going to be a referendum, a national referendum on which brand of populism, Trump's right wing or Biden's left wing, America wants. I think the really interesting thing to me is going to be where she is going forward 10 years from now. What path does America choose? And how does someone like AOC, who came into national politics as a radical, but as I write in the book, in the story of her political career, has really learned how to work within the congressional system and become effective, how does she carry that brand of politics forward 10 years from now and put into practice the kind of policies that Biden has begun to implement, but there's still a long way to go in order for Democrats to get to that kind of social democratic vision that I think is the one that she wants.
I think if we're sitting from the year 2019 and thinking about the American political system, the most surprising thing that one would have taken from your answer is Joe Biden's populism.
Yes.
That is very much not on the table from our political consensus perspective. So articulate what you mean by Joe Biden's brand of populism.
So I think that the like kind of the wildest, most interesting story in our politics today, sitting in plain sight, is the evolution of Joe Biden from a senator from Delaware who, in the 80s and 90s and even the 2000s when I came to Washington and started my political reporting career, was basically viewed as Wall Street's best friend in Washington. Bob Dole once famously ribbed Biden as the senator from corporate America because he represented Delaware, and that's where most corporations are. And the fact that Biden has gone from being the senator of corporate America to beating the populists in 2020, but really evolving the Democratic Party, especially on matters of economics, industrial policy, that sort of thing, really in the direction that politicians like Sanders and Warren have been advocating for years, I think is like the striking achievement of Biden's presidency. And the fact that he's governed very much along the lines as Warren and Sanders would have wanted him to, at least on economic matters. And not only that, but brought into the upper levels of his administration Warren staffers and allies like Ron Klain, and it watched and allowed them to kind of put a lot of these policies into practice. I think is like one of the most remarkable late in life political transformations that we've seen. And maybe it's because of social media, maybe it's because of the culture wars, maybe it's because of Trump. But I feel like people don't recognize that and appreciate that. And the real kind of conclusion at the end of my book is that while a lot of progressives and left-wingers that I know are, frankly, a little despondent that there isn't a President Bernie Sanders or there isn't a President Elizabeth Warren. The fact that Biden has been able to implement so much of their agenda really represents a triumph for the populist left that I wouldn't have imagined even 3 or 4 years ago, but certainly not back in, 2000 when I was going to congressional hearings. And Joe Biden, as the Delaware senator, was grilling Elizabeth Warren as the liberal Harvard professor. Never in a million years could I have envisioned how the Biden administration would unfold.
It seems to me the interesting thing about Biden's populist turn is it kind of went the opposite direction one would expect it to actually happen, especially based on the 2020 primary. So, for example, and you catalog this in the book, and this is something lots of folks have written about, very early in the primaries, the Overton window is obviously expanded. So you have, people like Beto O'Rourke saying, I'm going to take away AR-15s, clearly not something he would have said 4, 5, 6 years ago when he's running for Congress the first time. You then have all the Democrats, even the center left or centrist Democrats, like tumbling head over heels over each other to sign on to Medicare for all bills.
Exactly.
Very much not
Kamala Harris was the first one, right?
First one, which is not something that would have happened before. Joe Biden, very much though, is not a part of that political dynamic. I think Biden's successful political instinct was understanding that 2020 wasn't a policy battle. It was basically a we don't want Trump to be president battle. And that was the first question Democratic voters were asking, like not what's the wonky take here. But I guess my real question is, what then, if he didn't make all of the policy turns during the campaign, what do you think is happening when he comes into office in 2021 and starts to actually like take that turn itself?
That is such a great question. The first one and also the second one, to me, kind of as I look back, I think about the book sort of as the modern history of the Democratic Party, and I'm kind of writing almost kind of from a historian standpoint, stuff that I covered in real time as a reporter. And so as I was going back over those 2020 primaries and kind of the period leading up to them, like looking back, the thing that jumps out at me so much now was just how wild it was that those primaries were framed and shaped and fought over, frankly, radical ideas about whether or not we should wipe out America's, private insurance system and replace it with a $30 trillion Medicare for all plan, which was like what the Democratic primaries were fought over. And I think it's entirely to Biden's credit. And honestly, it's a little bit unbelievable that other people didn't have the same insight that Biden did, was that, listen, Americans who are considering voting for a Democrat and who are unhappy about America under Trump they're looking for the surest pair of hands to eject Trump from the White House. And Biden isn't the most charismatic politician, but he's moderate, he's safe seeming, he didn't fall all over himself to endorse Medicare for all, and in fact, said so on the debate stage. And I think that was his key, the key to his victory in the Democratic primaries. But I also think that the reason Biden turned to the left, traditionally you win the primary, you're supposed to pivot to the center. Biden really didn't do that in 2020. I think he pivoted to the left, certainly on matters of economics and some of the things that Warren and Bernie were pushing, and definitely as a president governed more as an economic populist than anyone would have imagined. And I think that is because Biden was in the White House as Barack Obama's vice president in 2009, as that administration was responding to the last great financial crisis, the financial crisis of 2008. Well, Biden wins the White House finally now, and what does he inherit? He inherits an even deeper financial crisis. And I think that this is a lot of the history that I tell in The Rebels. I think that Biden looked back at the way the Obama administration handled the aftermath of the financial crisis. 7 years it took to rebuild, to recover the jobs that were lost, long period of austerity, a lot of anger that led to this populist backlash on the right and the left, Occupy Wall Street, the Tea Party, eventually the rise and election of Donald Trump. I think that Biden saw all that and instinctively understood that the response this time around has to be fundamentally different than the one that Obama and Biden instituted back in 2009. And that means in particular that it can't be geared at saving banks, even if that's necessary to prop up the economy. It needs to be, the term Biden used, I think, is middle out recovery this time, but it needs to be focused on the middle class. And I think that the clearest influence of my characters in the book, Warren, Bernie, and AOC, was that in 2009, Warren was the TARP oversight cop. She was appointed to this board to kind of police the Wall Street bank bailout. And at the time had a lot of ideas about what Obama ought to be doing to help the middle class recover, because that had been a lot of what she'd studied as a Harvard professor, had been the way bankruptcy can kind of ravage
Two
families.
income trap, like those dynamics.
Exactly. And she kind of handed this menu of policies like, student loan forgiveness, rent freezes, eviction moratoriums, and really very little of that got implemented in 2008, 2009. Well, in comes Joe Biden in 2021 and basically takes up the entire Warren middle class crisis agenda. And I don't think it's any coincidence, for as unpopular as Biden is in opinion polls, if you look at the economic numbers, we recovered the jobs lost to COVID in 2 years, not 7 years. We're at near record low unemployment, near record stock market. Inflation was high, but it's coming down. Looks like the Fed is going to cut interest rates. Biden's personal popularity numbers are fairly poor, but if you look at the kind of economic numbers, I work at Bloomberg, so I look at this stuff all day long. They really do suggest that we're on the cusp of morning in America again. If these numbers kind of keep trending this way during 2024, heading into November, could wind up as wind in Biden's sails.
It's really interesting when you're comparing, contrasting the response to the 2008 financial crisis and then the COVID crisis, because it seems as if that's just a perfect example of how, in the space of a little more than a decade, America itself changed, in the sense that, I was a junior in high school during the financial crisis. So I was about as like young as you could be and kind of like remember the debates and what was really happening. And you quote this in the book, but there really was this punitive view that people took of people who were underwater with their mortgages, or had really screwed up. And I think that something that helpfully came out of like the Trump backlash 2016 moment, this is everything from trade destroying jobs to the opioid crisis. I think there just was not as much appetite for people basically saying, F you, I've got mine, you take care of yours, which people were so explicit about in 2009. Like, this is Rick Santelli. That just
I
seems to
was
be a
about to
real way the
say, yeah.
country, I think that's just a discernible way. It also explains why Biden would take a different response than the Obama one, because it's the actual foundation of the country was different.
I think it's absolutely like in an elite kind of inside the Beltway political perspective. I know from kind of my day-to-day reporting and research I did for this book that one of the reasons for that was that people in both parties, including Republicans, to their credit, look back at that 2008, 2009 response and said, in hindsight, we didn't do nearly enough to help the middle class, and it helped give rise to this backlash that has upended both parties and their establishments in ways that we're still feeling the aftershocks from. And, you know, looks like we will through at least 2024, especially if Donald Trump comes back and wins the nomination. I think the other factor, though, is that um, Biden certainly and Democrats in general, I think, have a better understanding now of what can be done through the government to kind of help people now in a way that wasn't done before. And now, we can see in the macroeconomy the effect that an aggressive government intervention can have. And I do think, in fairness to the political establishments in both parties that didn't do this last time around, that it was made easier by the fact that it was a pathogen that was causing all this economic chaos. And so
Mhm.
you couldn't blame it, as Rick Santelli did, on your greedy neighbor who took out too big a mortgage, or, the libs or the MAGA people or whatever. It was just this terrible pandemic that had thrown all sorts of people out of work who kind of self-evidently were not at fault for their plight and needed to be supported and rescued from the economic carnage that was about to ensue.
Something I'm really curious about, I ask this for when I speak with guests who focus on this like post-neoliberalism discourse. So at the start of the book, you point out there are basically two dates that really matter for the purpose of the story. So there's the 2008 financial crisis period, but there's also like 1978, 1980, like this period where the Democratic Party takes a different position towards corporate money and its underlying set of policy beliefs as the New Deal coalition and set of policies kind of come collapsing around themselves. So here's the question. I think this is just like really fascinating. No one quite has an answer to it. So Reagan very much comes out of this inflationary New Deal, lack of faith in government moment. It seems to me that if Joe Biden loses re-election next year, a lot of the basic storyline is going to be, look, abortion was bad for the Republicans. Trump wasn't a great Republican nominee, but just like the inflation that was caused by all the COVID spending was just so big that it just overwhelmed and the American populace like punished Biden for it. I feel as if that is the storyline coming out of 2024, the progressive and left side, on also the right wing side too, of the populist movements will be an incredibly difficult place, which means it will be harder to kind of move on from that market story. I'm curious how you think about like that diagnosis.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. I mean, the remarkable thing, what what Biden needs to happen or wants to happen in 2024 is what happened to Ronald Reagan in 1984. That yes, he'd overseen this deep, well, at the time, deep recession and soaring inflation, but it was coming down. And as the famous ad told us, it's morning in America again, and enough Americans believed that because we weren't as partisan, quite as polarized as a country back then. Enough Americans believed it that Reagan was able to win a landslide reelection victory. I think for Biden, as I'd said earlier, like working at Bloomberg, I kind of stew in these numbers all day long, and you can kind of see in the macroeconomy and lots of different little measures like things beginning to turn in the right direction, especially if Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve start cutting interest rates again, as they've signaled they will, and as people expect them to start doing, maybe as early as March. All of that would be helpful to Biden. And yet, Americans are unhappy, and it's clear that they're unhappy about inflation, and it's hurt Biden's poll numbers in a way that, frankly, has surprised even me. Just to see the negativity and the bad feelings about Biden in particular among a lot of core Democratic groups, young people, minorities who traditionally you would expect to support him. I think that could be a real problem for him. But part of my it's not so much a message in the book, but part part of my message as an author who's written about the rise of this left politics and has been, frankly, personally a little baffled by a lot of the antipathy to Biden from the left, this kind of lefty doomerism about they don't like him, they want to support him. It seems to me, as I say in the book, that Biden has implemented a lot of these left populist policies, and that if he is defeated, certainly the conclusion among Democrats is going to be, well, Biden's loss invalidates these ideas. It shows that if you implement them, it leads to inflation, it makes you a one-termer, and I think it will make Biden and a lot of these ideas as toxic as Jimmy Carter was after he lost in 1980 to Ronald Reagan, which is also something I kind of wrote about in the book. After Carter's loss, the entire generation of ambitious Democratic presidential hopefuls after him immediately turned on him, embraced this kind of neoliberal market-friendly idea, and ran in an opposite direction than from what Democrats had traditionally embraced, being the party of unions, the party of labor and the working class, which they'd been from the 1940s until the 1970s. I think that the Democratic Party would undergo a similar evolution. I assume in the direction of sort of Larry Summers style austerity and hands off the economy. And I think that would be a huge setback to the characters that I write about who've pushed so hard to instantiate this version of left politics or left populism that's developed since the last crisis.
Well, I think what's interesting about that to respond is I don't think it's necessarily that um, also because Larry Summers is also one of these aging figures. It's not necessarily that history perfectly, repeats itself and you have the
Yeah.
Democratic Party turn towards Larry Summerism. But I think the pretty clear answer here, because this would mean Trump would be reelected, is you would have the Democratic Party turn itself clearer towards, look, we had the formula. The formula was suburban voters hate Donald J. Trump.
Yep.
They like normal things. Biden ran as a normal guy in 2020, and then he got all the Warren staffers in. Everything got all crazy of Bidenomics. Let's focus on being the anti-Trump majoritarian party, and then basically put all the economic stuff to the side. So it's not even that you need to become like this forward-facing neoliberal like it's 1985.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
could actually just embrace the status quo in a way that, separate from policy outcomes, I think is actually kind of intellectually defensible from a political consultative perspective.
I think it could be right. So you're not going to get the second coming of the Atari Democrats. What you could get instead is sort of Gretchen Whitmer running as a safe, younger, normie mom, Midwest governor who seems like kind of changing, a turning of the page generationally and policy wise from the left populist Biden years where, Warren and Bernie had a seat at the table. Yeah, I could definitely see that happening. It would be really interesting in a gruesome sort of way to see how Democrats do respond to a second Trump term, because that would mean that there has just been a colossal failure of Democratic governance, or at least of Democratic political execution. I think the first thing would be a general agreement. I think that Biden would sort of be Carterized. People would
Mhm.
say, what were we thinking? Renominating this old man. He was supposed to be a one-termer. He told us he was going to be a transitional president, and yet he didn't leave. And he and his unpopular vice president handed the White House right back to Donald Trump. So we will go back to sort of the era of the famous Democratic circular firing squad, where everybody will be stabbing everybody else in the back. But what emerges out of that policy-wise, I really don't know. I mean, I would like to believe that the lessons learned from the great financial crisis and its aftermath still do apply to a certain degree, because let's remember, it wasn't just Joe Biden that
Mhm.
responded to the COVID crash with a big stimulus and beefed up unemployment benefits. It was Donald Trump, to his credit, and it's Trump is the one who is begun or had begun to institute an industrial policy and raise tariffs with China, things that Biden has not stripped away. So certainly it would be a big setback to kind of the characters that I write about in The Rebels. But I'm like you said, I'm not sure that we would like suddenly revert to 1985.
I think what's interesting, and you have this great quote from Minnesota Fed Chairman Neil Kashkari, where he points out that he's a center right. He ran for governor of California. He's like a Republican.
Was in the Bush
He
Treasury, yeah,
Yeah, Bush Treasury. He
during the first
himself has
crash,
this.
yeah.
You have this great quote from him in the book where he says, "We just really did not focus enough on the people thing." So that's just an example of how just like at the end of the day, everyone has ideology, but there are just
Mhm.
certain facts on the ground, and it was just incontrovertible how politically and economically disastrous the response from 2008 was.
Yeah,
So here's a yeah.
and sorry, to me, if I just jump in, I mean, that's what's so interesting to me about writing this kind of like modern, intellectual, kind of reading and reliving and kind of thinking about this modern political history is like even now, just a few years later, you can see these enormous important lessons. I just think it's a cool thing to do. I mean, it was really the fun thing about kind of writing and reporting out this book was kind of writing a period that I'd lived and reported through in Washington. I was embedded with a lot of these people,
Mhm.
but to go back and rewrite it again, with the perspective of hindsight as modern history, like was really an interesting thing to do.
So here's something I'd love to understand. And I think this is a real testament to the way you write your books. The books to me are half policy, um, but also half politics, right? Like the hacky, unsexy side that I'm not particularly
Yeah.
attracted to, but I think it really matters. And the difficult thing when you're kind of making the case against like the neoliberal era or the Larry Summers era, all these different responses is you can argue to your lungs are just totally out of air that the policies adopted by the post 1980s New Democrats or the Obama administration weren't actually up to the task. Also, let's add Bill Clinton to that. But politically, these were successful responses. You have a Democratic Party rebuild. Let's put aside Congress for a second, but like
Yeah.
at a presidential level, you have the Democratic Party rebuild itself. Barack Obama's reelected. No one disagrees. Obama wouldn't have won a third term if we didn't have that whole constitutional amendment
Yeah.
thing. So it seems to me the challenge for AOC, because of these three figures, to your point, she's the one who's going to matter longer term in terms of being an actor on stage. It
Mm.
seems to me the problem for post neoliberalism is that it hasn't put together any evidence that it's a politically successful program. 50 years from now, we
Mhm.
could say Bidenomics made the moves we needed with chips or made the
Mhm.
moves we needed with climate change. But I don't think Joe Biden's going to win re-election next year because of the specific like Bidenomics speech he gave. So like, where's the evidence that left populism and center left like reformist populism is successful at the ballot box? That seems to
Well,
be the real
yeah.
challenge.
I mean, the first answer to that question is in order for it to be, Biden needs to win re-election because if he doesn't, I think that's sort of the end of the ball game. But as far as what it looks like going forward, you know, I came to believe kind of writing this book and especially watching the 2020 Democratic primaries unfold. I was kind of embedded with Warren for a while and then Bernie for a while, and I kind of saw all the rising excitement of the left, thinking that we were on the cusp of big structural change and a radical presidency and all that kind of falling apart. I, I don't think that the way that this progressivism is going to work in the future is that someone like AOC is going to get elected president of the United States. I just have a hard time believing that because I think that for as admirable and talented a politician as she is, she's just coded as radical for too large a segment of the American electorate, and kind of openly lefty politicians. Like Warren, certainly like Bernie Sanders, I think they are too. And as we spoke about earlier, I think that's one reason why Democratic voters who are initially so excited about these candidates in the 2020 primaries eventually paused, thought about it, and said, you know what? I'm not going to risk gambling on a second Donald Trump term by nominating Bernie to be the Democratic nominee and then watching him lose in 2020. And to me, the kind of lesson in the Rebels is that you've had these three characters have given rise to this brand of populism, but it really took a normal, unthreatening, moderate figure in Joe Biden to take up these policies and enact them. And my hunch is that that's going to be how it's going to have to work going forward. So if you ask me for what what would a positive path for left populism look like over the next, let's just say 12 years to kind of do
Hmm.
it in presidential cycles? It would have to begin with a Biden reelection. And it's worth pointing out that all three of my characters, could have challenged Biden in 2024.
Yep.
AOC actually turns 35 in October, so she could just make it in under the wire if she wanted to. But all of them chose not to because I think they recognize that Biden is the vehicle forward. So first, Biden would have to win. I think then in 2028, you would have to have an appealing, broad tent uh, politician, someone like, for instance, Senator Raphael Warnock in Georgia, or Governor Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, or maybe like a Roy Cooper in North Carolina, take up these ideas. Um, these populist ideas, kind of the Biden industrial policy, the Trump tariffs, and say, listen, like this has worked. America's back. Biden won another term, presuming the economy is in good shape and growing by then. There'll be a lot of evidence that, instead of these years of austerity, we've found a formula through which Democrats can govern and really use the levers of government to benefit not just the middle class, but depressed areas in the Rust Belt that had lost jobs to the China shock, that sort of thing. That would be, I think, the hopeful path. But I'm not sure we're going to get there
Mm.
because I was actually in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, 2 weeks ago, the iconic steel town that lost its mill in 1985. Been very depressed since then. I went out to do a Business Week piece. It's actually an adaptation from the Rebels. It's going to run as a feature story in a few days because I wanted to take a look at, well, what does this look like on the ground? Aliquippa is fascinating because it's been in financial receivership since Ronald Reagan was president, lost half its population. Steel mill got knocked down. It lost jobs. U.S. Air was a major employer. It shut down a hub. I mean, it's the kind of place that reporters in 2016 would go into a diner and hear the people there talking about Trump. Ancestrally Democratic, but kind of blue collar, white working class had moved away from it. I picked Aliquippa because they just announced a few months ago that in the site of the old steel mill, they're now going to build a new low carbon steel mill because of a lot of Biden's policies, frankly. The Made in America provision and the IRA and other stuff has convinced this New York Steel company there's going to be a booming market for U.S. steel in the years ahead. So we're going to go and open up a new steel mill on this site. And about a week before I went out there, the city of Aliquippa, a very charismatic young black mayor there, held a public ceremony. The city had come out of financial receivership for the first time since 1987, and unemployment in the county was down from 10% when Biden was elected to 3.5% today. So I went out there and hung out with the mayor, Dwan Walker, who said, like, you wouldn't believe what's going on here. We have home builders building market rate houses in Aliquippa literally for the first time in decades. And I said, wow, so people must really be excited about Joe Biden. And he looked at me with a blank expression and said, nobody knows that Joe Biden has anything to do with this. People don't connect kind of what's going on the ground there to Democratic policies and to Joe Biden. And Biden hasn't been out to Aliquippa while he was president. But Walker, the mayor, told me, he said, who was actually here a few years ago was Donald Trump. He showed up. Shell was opening up a new petrochemical plant up the river that had been greenlit during the Obama administration. Trump showed up, held a rally for thousands of people at the plant, pointed to it and said, that wouldn't have happened if it weren't for me. So, you talked earlier about kind of the policy ideas and the politics. And I think of Washington as being kind of bifurcated between wonks and hacks. And what I relearned out on that trip to Aliquippa was that you can do everything right from a policy perspective and really help places that need it. But if you can't also do the grip and grin, showing up at the rally, kind of hack politics stuff that Trump is great at, you're not going to get credit for it, and it's going to imperil your reelection bid. And I think if Biden loses, it's not going to be because people take a look at his industrial policy and decided, no, that's not for me. That didn't work. It's because it will work, but they won't know that he's the one that deserves credit for it, and so they'll vote for someone else.
Here's something I genuinely don't understand, like being very, like I'm connected to like the DC space. Obviously, I work at a think tank, but I'm also like out here in Austin, so I'm not like in the scope of things. I don't understand why the Biden administration hasn't performed the politics of this differently. So, like, very explicitly, and you wrote about this in, Devil's Bargain, but, Trump has the Andrew Jackson portrait. Andrew
Yeah, yeah.
Jackson, and that's obviously like a Steve Bannon thing, but Andrew Jackson's there. Like, this is the metaphor, the metaphorical president who he's attaching himself to. Joe Biden very explicitly attaches himself to FDR.
Mm.
And it seems to me the obvious political play here would have been, hey, I'm obviously hobbled, not mentally. I think Biden's 100% there mentally, but I think at a political performance level, he's definitely slower. He doesn't translate to the social media age.
Mm.
I guess I don't understand why there aren't like a bunch of like modern day Francis Perkins or like Alina Khan, but like for an issue
Yeah.
that people actually are voting on. So once again, I think Alina Khan's done a great job at the FTC, but I also don't think that voters are actually voting on it. Like, I don't
Oh,
understand
totally,
why
totally. Yeah.
I don't understand why you don't find a like Lena Khan equivalent for the once again the CHIPS Act. There's a CHIPS
Yeah.
office in the White House. I'm just kind of curious, like maybe that's just me, just like kind of like Monday
No,
morning
it's not at all. That
quarterbacking.
was
But I'm curious what you think about that.
no, it kind of baffles me too, especially having been out and visited one of these, quote unquote success stories, and seeing the positive effects it's had, and then seeing the gap between, the economic effects on the ground and sort of the lack of political credit going back to Democrats and the Biden administration. I don't know. I think part of it is, look, Trump, for all his faults, loved nothing better than getting out there, holding a political rally out in real America, rallying the troops, turning it into an event, taking credit, basking in voter adulation, the whole nine yards. And Biden, either because of his age, I do think is a big factor, or because of his handlers, simply hasn't done that and doesn't really do that much in a way that I think he should. It may just be that his age and stamina are too much of an impediment. But I think the other reason is, Biden is heading out to Philadelphia to, I think he's giving a speech at the Liberty Bell. He instead has chosen this theme of, we need to save American democracy from
Hmm.
Donald Trump, which, certainly resonates with a lot of Americans. The thing I would question is, if your motivating issue as a voter is saving America from Donald Trump, I think you're pretty likely to be a Joe Biden voter already. Whereas, if I were in the White House, I would send Biden to Aliquippa, to a corner of a very important swing state, and say, listen, politicians have been coming through here since Ronald Reagan was president and they shut down your steel mill, telling you that they were going to make Aliquippa great again. They were going to bring back jobs, prosperity. We'll look down at the Ohio River at what's going up there, a brand new steel mill that has, come in because of my policies. Houses are being built, jobs are being created, unemployment is down, and I need you to recognize that I'm the one that delivered that. And if you elect me to another term, you'll get 4 more years of movement in this positive direction, which you've lacked for the last, 40 odd years. You know, to me, that's the argument that a President Biden should and can justifiably make based on the policies that he's instituted as president, especially when you consider the fact that really this election is going to come down, as it has the last two
Hmm.
cycles, to three Midwestern states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Trump swept them all in 2016 and won the White House. Biden took them all back in 2020 and won the White House. And I think if either candidate sweeps all three of those in November, that person is almost guaranteed to be president of the United States. So I would certainly put more of my effort on a kind of chips economy kitchen table focus and point to the things that I've done, than talk about these kind of more abstract themes of preserving American democracy. But again, I'm a journalist and an author. I'm not a political strategist, and the people in the Biden White House seem to have slightly different ideas.
Yeah, and I think this actually gets to the, for this last third of the conversation, this gets to the subtitle of the book, which is like a new politics. And I think this also brings together your Bannon book here too, which is I'll just tell you this. I launched the Realignment in 2019. Like actually like your book and the framing of this opportunity. Like I wasn't like pro-Trump, but I definitely like saw, okay, there is this moment that this is why Bannon's an attractive figure to people, despite everything Bannon-y.
Absolutely.
He more
Compelling,
than
yeah.
any other figure I could really think of in our political system is really good at articulating
Yes.
um
Yeah.
the opportunity to break ourselves out of just swinging back and forth every 4 to 8 years. Um, I feel as if the biggest failure on the populist rights front, to switch to that side of the conversation, is they have not built a new politics. And it would be very hard for you to write. I was going to ask you, I guess I kind of am asking you, if you were to write a version of this book that focus on the new right or the
Mm.
populist right, who would be the two or three people? It's not quite clear, but you could write a book. Or here's the thing, you could definitely write that book. You could have like, Senator Vance, you could have Senator Rubio. You could do it, but there'd be too many tangents, and you'd say, well, okay, was this January 6th, or was this like censorship, or was this like what kind of happened there?
Well, and also none of those peoples are the actual drivers and protagonists of what's happening in Republican politics. I don't think you could do that book. I mean, there just isn't. Trump is still the dominant figure. He's the sun that everyone revolves around. We see Tom Emmer, House Republican, who wanted to be Speaker, whose Speaker bid Trump brutally deep sixth in the aftermath of Kevin McCarthy's ouster, comes out, swallows his pride, and endorses Donald Trump for president. I mean, they're the only meaningful figure in Republican politics and policy today is Donald Trump. And because Trump doesn't really have a policy agenda, I don't think the new right really stands for anything policy-wise. I mean, I guess if you wanted to kind of boil it down, you could say,
They're
uh, you know,
intuitions, like there are Trumpist intuitions and
exactly.
notions.
I was gonna say impulses. Like
Yeah.
there'd be, anti-China, anti-immigration, build the wall. You could certainly craft slogans, but Steve Bannon doesn't have like a five-part plan for immigration reform or anything like that. It's just build the wall and deport everybody left inside. And so there really isn't a new right. It's sort of more of it remains a cult of personality. And I think that's one reason why Trump is, I think, going to traipse through the Republican primaries and be the nominee again come this summer.
Something I wonder then, eventually, whether it's this year or in 2028, Trump will leave the political stage. Do you think the new right gets rolled effectively without Trump as broad cover? A good example of this kind of debate was you had
Yeah.
Nippon Steel buy, try to buy like the American Steel Company last month.
Yeah.
And Michael Strain, he's at AEI, he's a traditional like conservative on
Yeah.
economic questions, very much not in the frame of like this show, but he just sort of says, hey, JD Vance could only get two other Republican senators to say that like they were opposed to Nippon Steel buying this American steel company. I think it's possible that the new right is overrated as a political group. And I kind of wonder then within that category, and this is separate from the debate over whether or not Nippon Steel is a good idea. Just it seems to me that like the advantage the populist left has is that because there are a broader set of ideas that aren't revolving around one individual, even if
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
AOC retires or Bernie retires or X, Y, and Z, Biden like, wins re-election, there's still a body of work there that will like live on by definition.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's funny. I was going to jump in a different direction to answer that, which is to say that, I mean, to me, the clearest sign of the emptiness of Trumpism as a policy agenda is to look at what happens to Republicans who run in off-year elections when Trump is not on the ballot. They lose. They lose in suburbs, they lose in they lose across the country. And that's one reason why Democrats almost won back the House in 2022, despite predictions of this big Republican wave. The problem is if your party is built around this kind of cult of personality, you need that person to be the unifying force to win elections. That's one of the things that's going to make 2024 interesting. I think you could also flip it around and present this as a problem for Democrats and specifically for my Democrats, the kind of left populists, because Democrats over the last 7 years have had the great advantage of having Trump be the unifying force that binds all Democrats together, progressives like AOC to centrists like Joe Biden. If you remove Trump from that equation, then I think you reopen a lot of the intra-party ideological debates that like really define Democratic politics throughout the 1980s and 90s, as I write about in the book. and really defined democratic politics in my political writing career from like 2000, about 2000 up until Trump got elected. And then all of a sudden, those debates stopped mattering so much because there was this sort of emergency among Democrats of we've got to bind together and get rid of Trump. So I think the future is wide open for both parties after 2024, and it isn't really clear to me where either, like, I don't have a strong conviction that the Republican Party is going to go in this direction or the Democratic Party is going to go in that direction, except to say that I do think there is more of an understanding that these populist impulses, whether it's kind of Trumpism or the left populism I write about, have a fundamental appeal to people that cannot be forgotten, and that returning to some kind of a anodyne heritage foundation style policy or Atari Democrat mid-80s market-friendly neoliberalism just isn't going to be compelling to a broad swath of American voters in 2025 and thereafter. I think even after these characters are all off the stage, including Donald Trump, they're going to continue to influence and shape the way that our politicians think and act and behave and try and appeal to voters.
Something I'm curious about, because this quote is used both positively and negatively. I wanted to hear what you think about this. So, famously, especially in 2016, Bernie Sanders was known as being just the economics first person. He's looking
Yeah.
at things through wages, workers, the economy, et cetera. And Hillary Clinton, famously poo-pooed that at a rally where she said, if we were to break up the banks tomorrow, let's give Bernie what he wants. Would racism be over?
Yeah.
And people say, obviously, that's obviously not true.
Yeah.
I want to focus, though, on the politics of that, because I think it actually gets to a core weakness of the Bernie side of the party, which is just that think of like the most heretical view I think Bernie held in 2016 was definitely his view towards migration and guest workers.
Mm.
There's that famous quote where he basically says, "Oh, like mass importing workers is a Koch brothers policy," and I think that's not Bernie being racist, is not him being anti-immigrant, it's him just seeing workers through the lens of wages and what does the actual labor pool in Pennsylvania look like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're looking at the modern Democratic Party, Democrats don't just see work like migrants through the lens of wages. They see it through the lens of child separation and border walls and nationalism. So it just seems that the whether or not like Hillary's quote was, I think, kind of just like defensive, like culture war liberalism. I think
Yeah.
at a political level, it gets at a weakness of the Bernie approach. I'm curious how you would think about this
Yeah,
dynamic.
well, and I'll say I don't think a ton of Hillary Clinton as a politician, but that was a devastatingly effective political attack on Bernie because he does think, and he did think of the world strictly. I mean, he's almost like a 1930s kind of, radical in the sense that to Bernie, everything goes back to economics. And I think he still sort of feels that at his heart. But what Clinton was doing there very effectively was signaling to black voters who are incredibly important in Democratic primaries that like this isn't a guy that thinks about you. This isn't a guy that has your interest in mind, and this isn't a guy that really has any connection to kind of the local Democratic parties like all across the South that are so important because Bernie frankly didn't, as I write about kind of in the Bernie section of the book. Um, I think that what happened in 2020 was almost kind of an overcorrection, that both Bernie and Warren became so convinced that they had to express a kind of, full spectrum leftism, not just on the economic matters that really motivated them, but on everything. And I think a big part of that was just the visceral reaction to Trump's racism, misogyny, xenophobia. It kind of created for a lot of liberals that I know and am related to, and certainly for like Warren and Sanders, a kind of moral imperative to take the maximalist position in opposition to Trump on whatever issue was out there that Trump was talking about. So if Trump thinks immigrants are rapists and he wants to deport them all, then by definition, all immigrants are good. We should open up the borders and welcome in anybody who kind of wants to come. Electoral consequences be damned. And I think that Democrats sort of like self-hypnotized into believing that there wouldn't be electoral consequences to this kind of behavior. That they basically,
Hmm.
and a lot of them still do this, folks on the left, they kind of try and like abstract away the practical political consequences that espousing those kinds of policies are going to have if you go out to America as, as Warren was at the time in fall of 2019, like the leading Democratic primary candidate, start pushing these ideas. A lot of people outside, Washington liberal progressive circles are going to sit up and think, wait a minute, this doesn't sound like something that I want. This sounds way too right. I'm all for a wealth tax. I'm all for
Hmm.
making Wall Street pay. And hey, you can break up Goldman Sachs while you're at it. But no way do I want to open the borders, and no way do I want to pay $30 trillion to fund a Medicare for all bill and give out my health insurance. And I think we saw very clearly the shortcomings of that kind of self-hypnosis in 2020 in the failure of both Warren and Sanders to emerge as the Democratic nominees.
Yeah, just quick last note before we get into the last questions. And actually, as we said earlier, the thing I would look at if Biden loses is a backlash on spending programs. And this is within the Democratic Party, but also on the border issue, because the other narrative, whether or not it actually decided things at the end of the day, the narrative is going to be Democrats became way too lax on the border issue, thinking that Trump had expanded the window too broadly. And this is, Mayor Adams getting in fights with governor of Texas and with the Biden administration. I think that's going to be a big narrative coming out of next year. So, okay. So, five quick, take as long as you need to answer these questions, but we'll just go through them one at a time. Quick question. What is it going to take to make progressivism or left populism attractive to actual voters of color, by which I mean voters in South Carolina, not like people who work at universities, think tanks, NGOs, et cetera?
An attractive and appealing mainstream Democratic politician to be the vessel for that. So my favorite guy is Senator Raphael Warnock in Georgia.
Mhm. So, and that's a good, and that's basically the point is the real test for left populism is you take Raphael Warnock or, yeah, okay, that's actually, okay, that's a good
Yeah,
answer.
like I think, I mean, the way to think about this is not to think of it in terms of, in order for left populism to succeed, we need to elect an AOC type, radical or socialist, whatever. I mean, at the end of the day, these are policies. This is a way of governing and a way of thinking about the world, and what the American political economy should look like. That could come in the packaging of an AOC or a Bernie Sanders. But, I submit in the book that it could and probably must, instead come in the packaging of somebody like Joe Biden, somebody like Warnock, somebody like Whitner, if it's going to succeed and appeal to that broad swath that you're talking about.
And I think this goes to your earlier point about how there's a part of the left that just appears very angry with Joe Biden. I think there's a part of the
Yeah.
left of my generational category, I'm 31, who just did not have it within their political imagination that their political task was to convince Joe Biden, a Joe Biden type, of
Yeah,
something by means that wasn't like a protest.
absolutely. And like, think about it from the standpoint of like a young radical leftist who's just discovered politics through Bernie Sanders, and it seems romantic and exciting, and then somebody like me or a political consultant comes in and says, well, actually, if you want a Democrat to get elected, you have to go convince this 50-year-old laid off union worker in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania to get on board with Bernie. And you're probably going to have to do a lot of compromising on your personal positions to get him there. That's not a lot of fun. It's more fun to go, put the rose in your Twitter bio and kind of, rant against the mainstream media or sell out politicians, and have a lot of fights on social media instead of going out and doing the hard work of campaigning and getting elected. That's why I think one of the paths forward we haven't really talked about is, the one place I really do see kind of positivity on the Democratic left is coming from the labor movement, frankly. Like if
Mhm.
you work for a union, if you're an organizer, you're out there in the real world talking to real people every day. And I think the fact that labor has seen a lot of successes in organizing recently gives me some hope that this brand of politics really does have kind of a path forward, and that the Democratic Party, especially younger folks like aren't kind of all consumed with identity politics and fighting on social media, that kind of thing.
Yeah, another quick question. This is more of a comment. I was reading the book. you spent so much time on Wall Street, justifiably as a
Mhm.
category. Wall Street has just vanished from our politics. It's so interesting.
Yeah,
Like the early 2010s American politics, and this is from reading your book, are just
yeah,
so centered on Wall Street. And not just like in response to the financial crisis, but it seems with all that energy, you kind of saw this with Wall Street bets for a second, but that was more of this other
yeah,
weird
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Like what happened to Wall Street as a
Well, look,
topic?
Wall Street, like quite obviously, was the bad guy in the 2008 financial crash. And that broad American animosity was compounded by the fact that Wall Street also was the vehicle for the recovery that Obama and Geithner chose. Now, maybe it had to be, and you could sort of debate the ins and outs of what they did, but certainly they were the great beneficiaries. Nobody went to jail, no big banks collapsed, and the middle class kind of suffered from it. So I think they made a very handy villain. Let's remember, we also went through that long period of austerity in the middle 2010s where millennials weren't getting jobs. AOC, if you kind of
Mhm.
rewind her story in my book, was working two different bartending jobs and
She hired a
struggling to
life
pay
coach. I
off.
didn't know that fact. She
Isn't
was
that
that,
isn't
like,
that
that's a
wild?
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So like things were not going well for people in the mid 2000s, and it wasn't hard to look at Wall Street and say with quite a bit of justification, it's your fault, and I'm angry about it, and I'm angry about the politicians that enabled it, and so I'm going to go vote for Bernie Sanders, or maybe if they were a little older, a different kind of unhappy worker, I'm going to go vote for Donald Trump. And so the fact that, we've lived through the financial crisis recovery, I think part of it is that COVID just kind of mixed up our politics and created new villains.
It
Uh,
doesn't,
you
there's not a convenient Wall Street for a variety of reasons doesn't fit
right,
onto the,
but also to tie it back to the book,
yeah.
um, I think Trump and Biden's response, heavily informed by my left populists to the COVID crash, has returned the economy to a state of health such that like it wouldn't be obvious to blame Wall Street for stuff. Warren and some other people have tried with the whole greedflation argument that corporate. It's not really catching on though, is it? So I think you're right. They don't blame Wall Street partly because other things have kind of superseded Wall Street as being a bad guy, but partly because the response to the COVID crash was so successful from kind of a financial and an economic standpoint.
Play your book editor for a second. Why did you not focus on tech? Tech is based, so
Mm.
you focus on like democratic activists who go into tech and build like mobilization platforms, obviously.
Yeah.
But like if the first half of the 2010s is Wall Street, second half of the 2010s for good or for ill is tech. Why was tech not a focus for you?
Interesting. I'd thought of the tech component, but as you said, like my interest was like I spent a lot of time with these kind of young Silicon Valley tech organizers who were trying to fix a problem that Democrats had. We have all these, young voters, minority voters. They didn't turn out for Hillary Clinton. Why not? How can we reach them? And they came up with like really interesting technological solutions that kind of short circuit, A, reached those voters, but B, short circuited the need to, for politicians to go hat in hand to big Wall Street banks. So I guess I kind of come at tech from a slightly different angle. But the other reason is that uh, the issues like antitrust, like even though they were talked about, like Bernie and Warren, I think both wanted like a new Glass-Steagall. That was kind of their line during the campaign. If I'd written this book and published it in the fall of 2019 or the spring of 2020 when those ideas are fresh, I think it might have been more about tech, more about antitrust, that sort of thing. But it just became clear in the 2020 elections that the only real issue was Donald Trump and whether or not he was going to get reelected. And I think the minute, I feel like there was like a break glass and emergency kind of moment maybe after the Nevada caucus, where Democrats just sat up and said, we're not willing to risk anything. Let's all rally and unite behind Joe Biden. Let's get rid of Donald Trump. And that basically eclipsed kind of the policy discussion on tech and other things. Um, but that certainly is going to be, a lingering and growing issue going forward. I mean, you can see it today, both in kind of the Lena Khan sense of
Mhm.
trying to implement new ideas about antitrust, but also in the furious backlash among both parties, but especially among Democrats to, Facebook, TikTok, all the social media companies that they blame rightly and wrongly for the rise in continued relevance of Donald Trump, the MAGA movement, things like that, and of course Elon Musk. We didn't have Elon Musk as a villain in my book. He kind of came late on the scene, but maybe for the paperback, I'll sort of tack in a new epilogue to
Yeah,
fold
it's a
him in
whole
and
other
get some
book.
tech in there.
So
Yeah.
last two quick ones. So quick one, is populism played out? Like I think a thing that Biden understands, and I think Trump is already not understanding with his jokes about being a dictator for a day. People are exhausted, and I think there's a at its worst, populists just sort of bring this pugilism to politics that
Mhm.
I think even for people who are sympathetic, they're just sort of like, man, there's been 10 years of this. So
Yeah,
is
I
populism still a useful like mental framework to bring to
yeah,
politics?
I disagree. Look, if you're talking about kind of Trump authoritarian populism, Um, that's certainly not what I'm arguing for, and I guess we'll find out pretty soon whether or not it's played out. But in terms of the economic populism, that's really kind of what I'm writing about. No, I don't think it is at all. And not only that, but I think it's necessary. I mean, Biden, economic populism is the thing that unifies Democratic voters, liberals, moderates. It pulls in independents. It pulls in a lot of Republicans. Talking about those kind of kitchen table issues, new jobs, building new factories. I think all of that is a positive. And that Biden, if anything, should be running as more of a populist progressive than he is, because as we talked about, he's doing good things in a lot of these swing states that people don't really know about or aren't giving him credit for. So the brand of populism I write about and I think about, I think is more important than ever. So I'd be a no on that one.
Okay, so to close us out, speaking of 2018, Marshall, who is excited about your first book, we've done a lot of like poo-pooing of like activists who are excited about things. Like, what is the new politics opportunity? You know, this for anyone who's coming to this space, I think there is still a opportunity to build a new politics and break us out of the
Yeah.
logjam. How would you kind of like sum up that opportunity that people could
Yeah,
take from the left or the right?
I think the opportunity on the left and the right doesn't really kind of get thought of this way. I mean, one of the themes in my book, I start in 1978 in the Carter White House, because for me, that's when Wall Street first kind of sunk its claws into the Democratic Party. And you see the rise of what was then called kind of neoliberalism. And you have this neoliberal era that I think lasts through, I would date it to 2008 in my book because that's when the financial crash was. But I think that ended a political era and it began a new one, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side. I don't think anybody recognized that at the time, but I think in hindsight that we can and we do. That's really been the theme of my last two books, Devil's Bargain on the right, Rebels on the left. I think the opportunity for young people is to figure out what a post-neoliberal politics is going to look like. I think there's going to have to be a fairly heavy element of populism, whether you're on the right or you're on the left. I think if you're on the Democratic side, the challenge is exactly the one you talked about earlier. How do you get, let's say, younger, multiracial demographic interested in these ideas? I think the challenge on the right is how do you put a set of policies uh, to kind of build out just this impulse that Donald Trump represents? I mean, how can you turn this into a kind of a responsible but also attractive governing vision that can pull in more voters than just the 46, 47% of the American electorate that Donald Trump is able to win? I think that's a challenge on both sides, is figuring out how you take those building blocks and move them forward in a way that is going to build an enduring and welcoming majority that not only wins you the White House, but gives you enough of a lock on the House and the Senate that you're actually able to govern once you are in the White House, which has been a rare, very rare thing over the last 20 years or so.
Well stated, Joshua. This has been so interesting. I hope folks check out, once again, I think these books should be read together, but obviously considering the release date, focus on the Rebels first. Thank you so much for joining me on the realignment.
Thank you so much, Marshall. I love the idea that this is like a two-set compendium that readers should buy and read them both. I hadn't thought of marketing it that way, but I think that's a brilliant insight on your part. So
The
thanks for
problem is
having
your
me.
book, the first book is a little too like Bannon centric, and you'd have to do,
Yeah, yeah,
okay, so then there was this thing,
yeah.
but I
Well,
think we could be discerning.
we'll let people make up their own minds. Maybe err on the side of reading them both. But no, thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
Thanks for joining.